is there some value in perhaps pursuing a new design?
Yeah, I love the idea that people are getting involved in this, especially our young people. And I would like to pursue this at least a little bit further. You know, you always understand the repercussions of something, but then there's always what are the unintended consequences. And you'd want city staff and the rest of the council to have an opportunity to think about the unintended consequences before you get too far down the road on this. But I think our flag today is a little bit underserving. You know, it's basically just the city seal placed on a flag, and we don't you know, display it too much. I mean, I'm guessing a very small percentage of our citizens know we have a flag or know what it looks like, and so I think people are developing more and more pride about the city. I think this is one way they could illustrate it. I also noticed that, you know, that from the sample that you've handed me here, just what a reaction you're getting from the entire community. I mean, many of these kids do not live in the city limits of Oklahoma City, or at least don't think they do. And you know, it's a reminder that, you know, this is a regional hub, and that people are proud of their city, and they'd love to see you know, some way to display it. And you know, who knows? Maybe we can put these in neighborhoods and schools and firehouses throughout the city.
That'd be great. Jumping to the Metropolitan Revolution, you've been elected to a leadership role in the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and will become president of that group in 2016. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
We're hearing more and more the phrase Metropolitan Revolution. I heard it in Dallas at the mayor's annual meeting, and at your development roundtable in May. What exactly is the Metropolitan Revolution?
I think it's a recognition that more and more people are moving to cities, and this is a worldwide trend. It's happening in Oklahoma and the United States, but it's happening all over the world. And we're also seeing an incredible influx of technology just affecting the way people run their daily lives. And so the question is, how is city government going to react? Is city government going to lead in the technology revolution? Is city government going to lag? And how are we going to work with the private sector and the expectations of our citizens? There's no question that the expectations from a technology standpoint from my 92-year-old mother and my 7-year-old granddaughter are vastly different. And from a city perspective, they're each citizens and each have their own expectations of how we're going to interact with them and what they should expect. And that's a challenge for cities across the country.
Is this role for cities substantially different from the role that they've played in the past, and if so, how?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's somewhat different in that you know, the technology expectations are so different and things change so rapidly. Traditionally, a city's capital investment might have been the airport, and it's a pretty safe assumption that airports are going to be around for a while, and you don't mind bonding that money out and building them over long periods of time and spending a lot of money on them. And then somebody comes up with some, you know, technology revolution, and you're thinking to yourself, well, in 2 years, is this still going to be relevant? And how much money do we want to sink into it? And so, you know, yeah, government investments in infrastructure and capital needs have always been extremely long term. And now we're looking at something potentially very short term, and I think we have to be careful. It's one thing for a private sector company to invest in a technology and find out that it's outdated very, very quickly. They can just you know, move on and invest in something new. But for a city to do that with tax dollars is another thing. And I think we're, to a certain extent, risk averse, rightfully so, at the city council level. And so I think you'll see that reflected on our ability to get involved in some of the technologies.
U.S. Conference of Mayors President Kevin Johnson of Sacramento promotes Cities 3.0. What is Cities 3.0, and is that the same as the Metropolitan Revolution? Do they complement each other?
Well, to me, there's a lot of overlap, certainly, but I think it's a recognition that the world is changing rapidly. And when you look at that next generation and realize that you know, the largest bookstore in the world doesn't have a physical bookstore, and the way that people are consuming and purchasing music is vastly different from the way it was when I was growing up. When you see the way Uber and Lyft are coming in and altering the world of the taxi business, you know, today's world is not the world of 10 years ago, and you wonder what it's going to be like 5 years in the future and 10 years in the future. And you know, when you think about it, you know, we're talking a lot now about what are driverless cars going to look like. And I'm thinking, well, how is that going to affect public transit? How is that going to affect traffic congestion? If that technology is within the next 10 years, then how are cities and departments of transportation going to adapt to what seems to be a technology that is, if not around the corner, not too many blocks away?
Jennifer Bradley, who was a speaker at this year's Mayor's Development Roundtable, is co-author of the Metropolitan Revolution. In her, and I think you're getting to some of these things, in her speech she described a successful 21st century city. As I recall it, that city is outward looking with a strong focus on entrepreneurship and on exporting goods and ideas. Mm-hmm. What's your reading of what will make a successful 21st century city?
Well, it's setting up the infrastructure so that the private sector can be successful and create jobs. And so that means, is your city wired? Are people able to get the technology capacities that they need? Are they able to work with city government, or are they working against city government? And of course, we want to be business friendly and try to help create jobs. And you also got to attract a highly educated workforce. And so we've done a lot in the last few years to try and attract what I call those highly educated 20-somethings that are highly mobile and are looking around the world about where they want to live. And it seems like we're doing a pretty good job of attracting them. I certainly see them in this community in much larger numbers than they were 10 or 20 years ago. How is this new population going to affect where the city goes from now? And who are the leaders of Oklahoma City going to be 10 years from now? So, I think there's every reason to be excited about Oklahoma City's future, but it's probably a little bit harder to quantify exactly how that leadership is going to take place.
Under state law, Oklahoma City relies to a great extent on sales tax to fund day-to-day operations and services such as police and fire protection. Does the tax system as it exists today limit the city's ability to foster the innovation economy that observers see as central to success?
I don't know that it affects the way the ability to fund our cities, but it affects how we fund our cities. And so because municipalities rely so heavily on sales tax for their yearly and daily operations, we are forced to chase retail. And so, literally in a smaller town in Oklahoma, getting a Walmart might be the difference between being a surviving community and not being a surviving community. And it shouldn't be that way. And in the larger city like us, it's amazing what it can mean to have Walmart or one of the big box retailers on this side of the street or that side of the street. And of course, we've seen Walmart kind of use that against municipalities, and they know how important it is about where they locate. And the smaller communities can be hurt drastically when a big box retailer moves and decides to locate, maybe just a few blocks away, but it can drastically change the ability to provide police officers and firefighters. And so the way you fund yourself shouldn't affect your planning decisions, but they do. And so what I think Mayor Bartlett and I are hoping to accomplish at the state legislature is minimally remind the state legislature of the fix they put us in. And because there's so much turnover at the legislature, I think it's good that we go back every few years and remind them that this is how we fund ourselves. Because I think it would be easy if you're at the state level to assume that the way the state government funds itself is the way cities fund themselves. And they're drastically different because we don't share in the income tax directly. And we don't share in much of the capital cost and the excess money that comes in off oil and gas drilling. We get incidental money from that and secondary money from all that, but it's just vastly different. And so we have to approach things differently, and I don't necessarily think that's appreciated much at 23rd.
The state government seem to you to have a more balanced system of providing for the revenue needed to provide services?
Yeah, state government seems to have a well-balanced funding setup of basically three sources, and we really have one source and then a lot of different sources. And when you look at how aggressive we've been to capture our retail, it's sobering to look and see that our suburban communities have had very similar growth patterns. So, you know, for all the work that we've done to try and maintain our sales tax base, our suburban communities have been just as effective. And you see it, down in Moore, where Mayor Lewis has done an incredible job of attracting retail along that I-35 corridor. And it doesn't take too much to see that in Oklahoma City, that I-240 corridor has suffered from it. And Crossroads Mall is not what it once was. And I think Moore and Norman have both benefited from a little bit of that sales tax exodus, that erosion that's left the city. And so that's one of the reasons we've been so aggressive to try and get that outlet mall out west. And we're investing in Quail Springs Mall out north. And we're trying to figure out how we can reinvent that I-240 corridor, because sales tax is going to be important if we intend to continue to add police officers.
Okay. Anything more on the ideas you're discussing with Mayor Bartlett? And do you see the possibility of creating a coalition among big city mayors, suburban mayors, and small town mayors to address what it sounds to me like you see as a common problem?
Well, I think the first step is just getting the state legislators to understand it, especially the newer ones who might be coming in and not being so well versed on municipal government. Because, for instance, every year there are sales tax exemptions created. And so some organization or some entity is trying to not have to pay sales tax on some certain items that they're purchasing. And at the state level, that impact on state revenue is here. Well, for a municipal government, it's here. And state legislators need to know that if they're considering a sales tax exemption, it's going to hurt cities more than it's hurting states. And I'm concerned that they will just look at it from a state perspective. And this is a kind of a round of information that I've typically taken to the state legislature, but we haven't done it in a while. And I know with the turnover out there, we need to do it. We're also, behind the eight ball when it comes to getting properly appreciated at the state legislature. The urban legislators from both Oklahoma City and Tulsa do not seem to bind together and want to work together on behalf of big urban cities. And the rural legislators don't seem to have that problem. When you look at the cliques and the way that the legislators break down and vote in blocks, it typically in Oklahoma City and Tulsa seems to be around partisan lines. And I see a lot of times that the rural legislators will stick together to try and push rural issues or to be aggressive against urban issues. And we need to remind the legislators of Tulsa and Oklahoma City that that they need to stand up for us as well.
The idea of tax reform is always difficult because it can create winners. Well, it does create winners and losers. Have you and Mayor Bartlett talked about how you address that challenge?
Well, neither one of us are trying to increase the amount of taxes that are levied on our citizens. But what we are trying to do is just try to get a more diversified stream of funding coming in. It would be nicer to have more options about operations. But I think we're not trying to to increase the amount of revenue that comes in. We're just trying to diversify the sources so we don't have dips. Oklahoma's economy, historically has been, through good times and bad times. And of course, when you look at a city government's expenses, it's a fairly consistent line that goes on a slight upward curve because our expenses are personnel driven. And if you give employees a small raise every year, which we would like to do when we can, of 1%, 2%, or 3%, then you're going to see your expenses go online. Well, your revenue, because it's tied to sales tax, goes like this. Okay. And it's harder to run an operation when your revenue is inconsistent and your expenses are consistent. And so that's why you see, cities from time to time having to lay people off. And we've been fortunate. We've been in, since I've been around City Hall, we've been in a general pattern of growth and haven't had to do that. And because we're so large, we have a few more options, that we can do. But, if you're a smaller town or community and you go through a sales tax dip, there's no question you're going to have to start, removing people from your payroll. And typically that means police and fire.
And that's a particularly acute problem in Tulsa right now.
Yeah, you know, and I'm looking at it from 90 miles away, and most of it is what I read in the paper, but it seems like they're experiencing that same type of sales tax erosion. They have very aggressive suburbs that are attracting retail and attracting new citizens, and as a result, you know, Tulsa is not growing at the rate of the entire metro area in Tulsa. And you know, that's not in Tulsa's best interest. I mean, you know, you can't be a suburb of nothing, and I hope the Tulsa communities can realize that what happens in Tulsa is going to be very important to what happens to the entire region.
The Cabela's tax incentive deal was recently discussed, and the economic development director in the city of Moore said on the radio that she would have offered them more to bring them to her community, despite all the controversy in Oklahoma City, to the extent that there was over the $3.5 million that they could benefit from over 10 years. That seemed to be a pretty stark reminder of the battle, if you would, for retail among communities in a metro area.
Yeah, and what it really comes down to is police officers and firefighters. And you know, we have a strong commitment to public safety. It is easily identified as our #1 priority. And if you can't maintain your sales tax base or hopefully increase it, you're not going to be able to put investments in those areas. And so there's no question that where a big box destination retailer locates affects the bottom line of the cities. Moore's had some great successes over the past few years, so has Edmond, but I'd like to think that we've held our own.
In that conversation about Cabela's, you said we're playing the hand we're dealt. Was there a sense of frustration in your voice that day when you made that comment?
Well, you know, there's typically an argument that we shouldn't be subsidizing private sector businesses, and you know, we can sit around and argue the philosophy of that. None of us like to get into the incentive game, but at the same time, we have a commitment to public safety. We have to have police officers and firefighters. They need the equipment and tools to do their jobs well, and we are having to fight for sales tax. And so we are dealing with the landscape as it exists, based on the enabling legislation that the state and the federal government have handed down to cities in Oklahoma. And to wish it were a different world is fine, but at the end of the day, it isn't allowing you to hire more police officers. So we've got to get out there and fight and claw and scratch and try and bring in these destination retailers the best we can.
And is there a benefit? Do you see a benefit to having those retailers in your community? And when I say that, a benefit to residents. I mean, is that what residents want?
Well, you know, from time to time, you know, I'll have a citizen who visits another community and they go in some sort of retail store and they'll say, wow, I wish one of these was in Oklahoma City. Or you'll have somebody that moves here and they're used to a higher level of destination retail.
Like Nordstrom, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, they will wonder why they're not in our market. And you know, it's not a lack of effort. I mean, there's a lot of variables that go into those figures. But yeah, it gets into the quality of life. I mean, there's an expectation of people that might have a favorite destination retailer. They don't want to drive to Dallas to have to shop for furniture or for electronics. And if, in their opinion, you know, your current level of retail is not meeting up to the expectations or their desires, you know, they're going to take their pocketbook and buy things on trips. And we want them to be able to spend their money here on the goods and services that they'd like to buy.
Could downtown use a department store, Target, grocery store? Are those things?
Well, that'd be nice, but you know, it's retail in a downtown area is really difficult because typically it takes a lot of parking and real estate is more expensive. And also, you know, it's very driven to demographics. You know, how many people live in the area and what's the income level of those areas. And so, typically, downtown areas don't qualify nearly as well as an affluent suburb, and so that's why you see retail move to those other areas. But yeah, we would love to see downtown retail grow because we have so many visitors from other places that come in, and we want them to spend their money when they're in Oklahoma City. From an economic development standpoint, it's pretty easy math. If someone earns their money in another community and they come and spend it in yours and then they leave, that's a net gain. And so that's why, you know, tourism and getting people to spend money while they're in the city is so important.
The city spends a fairly substantial amount of money for memberships in the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which you will be leading soon,
Mm-hmm.
National League of Cities, Oklahoma Municipal League. What are the benefits to the city and to the citizens from?
Well, you know, our expenses in those categories in the thousands of dollars and our benefits in the millions of dollars. And you've got to remember that we're at the bottom of the totem pole. And so, you know, cities react and operate under the enabling legislation of the state and the federal government. And if you're not making a very loud voice at the state legislature and in Washington, cities are going to get run over and ignored and taken advantage of. A lot of the efforts that we make, you know, frustratingly, are just in defense. In other words, somebody's trying to creep into our ability to fund our cities or trying to create an additional expense. So it's not like we're aggressively trying to improve our situation. A lot of times we're just trying to stop other people from keeping us from doing what we're already doing. And you know, there's a lot of that out there. There's also, you know, in Washington, a lot of money that leaves that the war chest and goes out to communities all over the country. And I feel a responsibility to see that the tax dollars that people in Oklahoma City send to Washington come back in an equal or perhaps greater amount. And so we are aggressive out there. And by staying in touch with the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities, it allows you to see what grant monies might be available, what matching dollars might be available. And there's a lot of times when, you know, we can put money into a project and get a match from another level of government. And I see that as a net gain for the community. And it allows us to address a lot of the social needs of the community. But you know, you've got to know what other cities are doing minimally, and you've got to be a loud voice in Washington if you want to be able to keep your city to tap into the tax dollars that are going the other way.
Oklahoma City weathered the recession fairly well. It's been a leader in areas such as housing values and unemployment. The latest report from on the U.S. metro economies that was released at the Mayor's Conference in Dallas predicts continued steady growth for Oklahoma City, but shows other metro areas moving forward at a faster pace. Is that a concern?
Well, I think what the current trend is that, you know, the bigger cities are getting bigger, and so yeah, if someone wants to make the point that you know, giant cities are continuing to grow at a very fast rate, and the smaller your community, the less your growth rate. I think there is some of that out there, but there's a lot of different opportunities for Oklahoma City to outpace the rest of the country on a per capita basis. And I don't necessarily want to grow too fast, too quickly. You know, we've seen what happens in growth areas like Phoenix and Las Vegas, you know, in recent memories, and how they grew so quickly, and then a housing bubble was created, and then when the housing prices started to drop, the economy cratered with it. And I'm pretty proud that Oklahoma City's housing prices have been a pretty slow but steady increase, that our job creation has been slow but steady. You know, when you're trying to run a government, there's nothing wrong with slow and steady. You know, if you're in the private sector, you know, you'd love these huge upticks and to see your stock market price go way up really fast. And you know, you can weather the other side of it. It's a little bit more difficult for a city to take on the really highs and the really lows, because it's difficult for us to react, and our revenues and our expenditures, you know, don't react as quickly as a private sector entity. I think we should continue steady growth. We're looking at population growth that's, you know, somewhere between 1% and 2% a year. It's higher than our traditional average, but it's certainly something we can sustain. We're seeing about 1,000 housing units a year come into downtown, which is a great trend. It's creating more efficiency. It's creating more density. And I think that's an acceptable growth rate that we can assume is going to be tapped into. So you can grow too fast, and if Oklahoma City has been, you know, kind of a slower pace but very steady, I think there's a lot of other cities that would be envious of that rate.
MAPS seems to be a reflection of that to some extent. It's measured, it's thoughtful, it's pay as you go. Mm-hmm. It's not race out, design something, borrow $400 million and build it.
Yeah.
Am I onto something there? Does that reflect sort of the character of Oklahoma City to some extent?
I think it's a reflection to some extent on the 1980s when Oklahoma's economy was so bad, and we saw that that was the result of some overzealous banking, and policies have changed, but more than anything, just the banking culture has changed, and I think this has been a community that's wanted the dollar in the bank before it was spent more than other places, and so. It's not that we don't have any debt at the city level, that we don't bond projects out occasionally and build them sooner rather than later. But with MAPS, I get a lot of feedback from our citizens. They like the idea that we collect the money before we start to spend it, and we don't get in a big hurry. In a lot of communities, there's a tendency for elected officials to want to see money spent as quickly as possible so that it can happen in their tenure and while they're in office. And here what you've seen is very clear handoffs from one mayoral administration and council leadership opportunity to another. And so that, MAPS projects have typically been tied to mayoral leadership, even though we all know it's much broader than that. But that's typically how people perceive it. And so that one mayor's term has seen something pass, and there's another mayor or two that's along in the oversight, and then the private sector reaction, happens years and years later. And I like that aspect of it, because if you're stopping and starting all the time, your wheels are just spinning and you're not going anywhere. And in Oklahoma City, I think that the clean handoffs that we've had from a leadership standpoint is appreciated and allows us to, I think, to have a very firm belief that we're going to grow well into the future. Oklahoma City's success in the last few years doesn't seem to be some flash in the pan. It seems to be based on something solid and significant. And I still think the next 10 years are going to be better than the last 10. And the last 10 have been pretty amazing.